Καλό σας βράδυ, αγαπητοί φίλοι τηλεθεατές. Και πάλι κοντά σας, εκπομπή Δραξασθε Παιδειας. Το θέμα μας σήμερα, προσεγγίζοντας τον Καβάφη μέσα και έξω από τη σχολική τάξη. Σε μια εκδήλωση που έγινε στις 8 Νοεμβρίου του 2013, στην αίθουσα Europe House, στο 32 Smith Square, London SW1. Ο Καβάφης παρουσιάστηκε μέσα από την ελλαδική εκπαιδευτική αποστολή. Το Γραφείο Εκπαίδευσης και η κυρία Βαρβάρα Καμπουρίδη, συντονίστριά μας, είχε την όλη ευθύνη για την εκδήλωση αυτή, της οποίας μέρος θα παρουσιάσουμε απόψε στην αγάπη σας. Η εκπομπή ξεκίνησε με χαιρετισμό από την Αγγελική Πετρή. Στην συνέχεια η ίδια η κυρία Βαρβάρα Καμπουρίδη χαιρέτησε τους καλεσμένους και κάλεσε τον πρέσβη της Ελλάδος, τον κύριο Μπίκα, να δώσει το δικό του χαιρετισμό. Μέρος στην εκδήλωση πήραν ο δόκτωρ Άντωνη Χέρστ, η δόκτωρ Χριστίνα Αργυροπούλου, η δόκτωρ Εκατερίνη Δανιήλ, η δόκτωρ Δήμητρα Τζανιδάκη με τον Γιώργο Βαφάκη διάβασαν ποίηματα και στη συνέχεια ο Βόρος Κωνσταντίνος μαζί με την παρέα του παίξανε μελοποιημένα ποίηματα από τον Καβάφη. Ας παρακολουθήσουμε μέρος αυτής της εκδήλωσης.
Οι εισηγήσεις θα μας βοηθήσουν να κατανοήσουμε το γιατί και το πώς διδάσκεται ο ποιητής στις δύο αυτές χώρες, ενώ οι απαγγελίες και οι μελωδίες θα μας οδηγήσουν στο να νιώσουμε την ποίησή του βαθιά μέσα μας και να στοχαστούμε. Θα χρησιμοποιηθούν και δύο γλώσσες, ελληνική και αγγλική. Στο σημείο αυτό θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω από καρδιάς όλους εκείνους που συνετέλεσαν την πραγματοποίηση της σημερινής μας εκδήλωσης. Εισηγητές, ηθοποιούς, μουσικούς, εκπαιδευτικό και διοικητικό προσωπικό του Γραφείου Εκπαίδευσης, τους εράσμους φοιτητές μας, το Hellenic TV και βέβαια την Αγγελική την Πέτριτς, που ως υποδέσποινα μας υποδέχτηκε σήμερα στο Europe House. Να της ευχηθούμε και χρόνια πολλά, γιατί σήμερα, αν το έχουμε ξεχάσει, είναι το Αρχαγγέλιο Μιχαήλ και Γαβρίλ. Και βέβαια την Ευρωπαϊκή Επιτροπή. Κύριε Πρέσβη, θα ήθελα να σας παρακαλέσω να μας απευθύνετε δύο λόγια για τη σημερινή εκδήλωση.
Good evening. I will be short. I think it's an excellent opportunity that we're here to celebrate one of the great poets of the 20th century, Konstantinos Kavafis, who, as I understood, coming here, had his roots in British poetry, some of his roots, because he's very original in the British poetry of the 19th, the Victorian, of the early and mid-Victorian time. I'm delighted to hear our main speaker to speak about Kavafis, and I also want to thank your Eurohouse and Ms. Petris for this welcome. Χαιρόμαστε πάρα πολύ που είμαστε εδώ. Συγχαίρουμε που congratulate Ms. Kambouridi for this wonderful initiative that she took to organize this thing. Σας συγχαίρουμε για την πολύ ωραία πρωτοβουλία που πήρατε να οργανώσετε αυτή την συνάντηση για αυτή τη λογοτεχνική βραδιά. Και νομίζω ότι θα πρέπει να προχωρήσουμε στο πρόγραμμα. Ανυπομονούμε όλοι πολύ να ακούσουμε τον ομιλητή μας. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Θα ήθελα να παρουσιάσω για λίγο τους ηθοποιούς μας, οι οποίοι θα μας συνοδεύσουν σήμερα. Η κυρία Δήμητρα Τζανιδάκη Κρέψ studied classics in Athens and in London, where she completed her PhD. She also trained as an actress at Central and completed her master's in physical theatre. She combined teaching at the University of Reading, funded by the Ministry of Education, with performing in theatre and film. And George Vafakis studied drama at the University of Exeter and then completed his actor training at the Drama Studio London. He has co-founded the Bridge Arts Theatre Company, which promotes exciting new writing. Thank you very much for your participation, and I call Mr. Janidaki.
I am not a Greek, I am a Hellen. To be Hellenic is the closest one can get to being godly on earth. And to lose this quality is a kind of a fall from earthly paradise. Far from any paradise lost, Kavafi is the poet's poet. In the Greek anthology of the Center for the Greek Language, some 135 poems were written by some 153 poets from 20 different countries, all inspired by Kavafi's poetry, the so-called cavaphogenic poetry. He was, of course, born in Alexandria, that city so marvelously deprived of the melancholy of ruins, as Marguerite Yourcenar used to say. He died in Alexandria too on the 29th of April, the day of his birthday, on the second floor of a 3-story apartment block in 3 Lipsius Street. Where could I ever have lived better, he said. Underneath me is a brothel that attends to the needs of the flesh. In the corner is the Greek Orthodox Church of St. Saba, which forgives the trespasses of the flesh. And opposite me is a hospital where we will all end up dying. When he won the Nobel Prize for Poetry, Seamus Heaney, the poet laureate, said, 3 were my teachers in poetry, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Cavafy. And here, to shed his own light on why is Cavafy not a poet of old age, but of future generation, and a poet that is still read in terms of being synchronically, in terms of synchronically produced poetry, is Dr. Anthony Hirst, retired but very well published cavaphist at Queen's Belfast, who is also the editor of the bilingual translation of Sakperoglu of Cavafy's collected poems, and his own translations of Cavafy's poems are forthcoming in the Modern Greek Library of Classic Authors. So I leave you in the safe hands of Dr. Anthony Hirst. Thank you very much for being here.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak here this evening. As we've heard, it's the 150th anniversary of the birth of the Alexandrian Greek poet Konstantinos Petru Kavafis, who, when writing in English, as he often did, styled himself C.P. Cavafi. It's also, of course, the 80th anniversary of the poet's death. And here we see his last resting place, in the Greek Orthodox Cemetery of Alexandria. Cavafi fulfilled the biblical lifespan of 80 years and 10, the Evdomikonda Eti of Psalm 89 of the Greek Bible, with unusual precision, dying in the early hours of the morning on his 70th birthday, the 29th of April, 1933. In the first months of 1933, the last months of Cavafi's life, there was probably only one person in the world who would not have been surprised to learn, had such a thing been possible, that in 50, never mind 80 years, Cavafi would be a poet of international renown, translated into more languages than any other Greek writer since classical times. And only one person who would not have been surprised to learn that the 150th anniversary of his birth would be proclaimed the year of Cavafi by the Greek Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs, Culture and Sports. And this would entail hundreds, if not thousands, of events around the world. And of course, that one person was Cavafi. Cavafi's concern for his reputation was well known in Alexandria and Athens, and became the object of satire, as is illustrated in this cartoon by Nikos Papas, which is not, I think, vicious so much as gently teasing. Here we see Cavafi in bed, and we see his bedtime reading, the books lying on the floor. These are volumes about Cavafi by 2 of his contemporaries, books which in 1926, the date of the cartoon, did not exist, though the 2 authors whose names can be made out, Stefanos Pargas and Timos Molanos, had already published articles about Cavafi. Cavafi was his own most perceptive critic, and we've direct evidence of his own high estimation of his work. He contributed many anonymous notes to the journal Alexandrian Techni, Alexandrian Art, of which he was the unnamed editor-in-chief, notes in which he discussed his poetry or countered critics, always referring to himself in the third person. But the most interesting example of Cavafi's critical self-promotion appeared not in Alexandrian Techni, but in the Cairo-based French-language weekly of the Greek community in Egypt, La Semaine Égyptienne, in a special edition, an affièrement, devoted to Gaddafi, which was published on the 25th of April 1929. The piece appeared as one among many brief appreciations of Gaddafi's work. Its named author was Apostolos Leondis, the editor of the Alexandria Greek newspaper Takidromos. But we have the testimony of Mrs. Eftichia Zelita, the manager of the Gramata bookshop in Alexandria, that this short article was dictated in French by Gaddafi himself in her bookshop, where Gaddafi was a frequent visitor. Here then is part of what Gaddafi, behind the mask of Leondis, said about Gaddafi. In my opinion, Gaddafi is an ultra-modern poet, a poet of future generations. In addition to his historical, psychological, and philosophical significance, there is also the sobriety of his impeccable style, which sometimes approaches the laconic. His tempered enthusiasm, which brings with it a kind of cerebral emotion. His precise phrasing, the product of a natural aristocrat. And his delicate irony. These are among the features which will be appreciated even more by future generations, impelled by progress and discovery, and by the subtlety of their mental faculties. The rare poets like Gaddafi will then hold a predominant place in a world which will think a great deal more than we do today. Vanity? Arrogance? Yes, well, of course. But not mere vanity. Had Gaddafi been wrong, had he been forgotten by now, these words would appear to be an example of very foolish vanity. But he was right. His work has been appreciated more and more with each passing decade. He has indeed become a poet of future generations, and we are those future generations now celebrating the year of Gaddafi. The subject of the Shakespearean question, to be or not to be, is Gaddafi's reputation. And whatever Papas may have thought in 1926, the answer we now know is positive. His reputation was indeed to be. It's probably true to say, though, that never has so great a literary reputation been built on so small a body of work. Gaddafi's reputation rests on 154 mainly short poems which he himself kept in circulation, or at least republished in journals, in the last decade of his life. The longest poem, and longest by a wide margin, is 90 lines in length, the shortest just 4 lines long, the average about 15 lines, less than 2,500 lines in total, about 100 printed pages. Of course, there are other poems by Gaddafi, about 140 more. There are the poems that he published before 1904 and later rejected, or at least never republished. There are the poems that he completed but for various reasons chose not to publish. And then there are the 30 unfinished poems which were not published in their entirety until 1994 and are still relatively little known. Here is another cartoon by Nikos Papas. Here we see Gaddafi embarking on a voyage, setting out for Ithaca, perhaps, crowned with laurels, clutching the lyre, symbol of the ancient Greek bards, with a manifesto rolled up under his arm, and the name of the journal he founded, Alexandrini Techni, on the pennant of the ship. A tiny ship. But the principal irony lies in the name of the vessel, Kleontinian, Tinian ship. For in Gaddafi's poem, In the Harbour Town, the young man who arrives on a Tinian ship, a ship that is from the island of Tinos, has been taken ill on the voyage and dies soon after he's brought ashore. The poem is set in the Roman period in the Greek-speaking province of Syria. The speaker lives in the harbour town in question. And this is the first of several poems I'm going to read in my own English translation, to be followed by a reading of the same poem in the original Greek by our distinguished actors here. In the harbour town, a young man, 28 years old, arrived here in this Syrian harbour town by Tinian ship. Emis by name, his plan had been to learn the perfume trade. But on the voyage he'd fallen ill. Scarcely had he been brought ashore before he died. His funeral of the poorest sort was here, Just hours before his death, he'd murmured something about his home and aged parents. But who they were, none of us knew, nor where his homeland in the wide Greek world. It's better so, for now, while he lies dead here in this harbour town, his parents can go on thinking that he's living still.
Νέος, 28 ετών, με πλοίον τίμιον, έφτασε εις τούτο των Συριακών επίνιων ο Έμις, με την πρόθεση να μάθει μυροπόλια. Όμως αρρώστησε εις τον πλούν και μόλις απεβιβάστη, έφανε. Η ταφή του πτωχοτάτη έγινε εδώ. Ο λίγες ώρες πριν πεθάνει κάτι ψιθύρισε για οικίαν, για πολύ γέροντας γονείς, μα ποιοι σαν τούτοι δεν εγνώριζε κανείς. Μήτε πια οι πατρίες του μέσα στο μέγα Πανελλήνιον. Καλύτερα. Γιατί έτσι ενώ κοίται νεκρός σε αυτό το επίνιον, θα τον ελπίζουν πάντα οι γονείς του ζωντανό.
This seems a poem entirely without irony, a simple, pathetic and poignant story told by a stranger who happened to know it, who had been there. The important point I want to take from it is just that the speaker is not Kavafi, the voice is not Kavafi's voice, but the voice of a character who speaks from within the situation that he describes. The poem is, in other words, a dramatic monologue. A dramatic monologue is a text in which a single voice, which is demonstrably not the voice of the author, speaks throughout with no framing narrative or context, other than what is provided by the speaker's words and sometimes the title. Tennyson is usually credited the invention of the form in his poem Ulysses, in which the speaker, Ulysses or Odysseus, identified by the title, speaks of his restlessness now that he is home again in Ithaca, speaks of his desire and intentions to go to sea again in search of further adventures. This is an idea which has its origin in Dante's Inferno. Kavafi knew this poem of Tennyson's well. He wrote about it in an essay, and in that essay he translated large parts of it into Greek. And in 1894 he wrote his own version of the story in a poem called A Second Odyssey, Δεύτερα Οδύσσεια, a poem he never published. I'll read only the last few lines to give the flavour of it. And as the shores of Ithaca gradually faded from his sight, and with full sail he made towards the west, towards Iberia and the gates of Hercules, far, far beyond the Achaean seas, he felt he was alive again, that he was throwing off the heavy chains of familiar and familial things, and his adventurous heart coldly rejoiced, devoid of love. The Second Odyssey is not a particularly good poem. It's loosely constructed and some of its effects are rather forced, but it shows us Kavafi beginning to find his own poetic mode, although the heroic tone of the poem, derived from Tennyson, does not really suit him. Perhaps the earliest poem in which one feels Kavafi has indeed found his own voice, his own style, is The Death of the Emperor Tacitus. This is another early poem, but one which in this case Kavafi did publish in 1897, though he later rejected it, but perhaps only because, as he noted, the Roman Senate was not malicious in sending the aging emperor on campaign. The Emperor Tacitus is sick. At his great age, he's been unable to withstand the rigors of campaigning. Confined to bed in hateful barracks in vile Tyana and far away, he's thinking of his dear Campania, his garden there, his villa and his morning walk, his life 6 months ago. And in his agony, he starts to curse the Senate for its malice.
Είναι ασθενής ο αυτοκράτορ Τάκητος. Το γύρας του δεν ειδηνήθη το βαθύ του σκόπους του πολέμου να αντισταθεί. Εις μισητών στρατόπεδων κατάκητος, η στάθλια τα τίανα, τόσο μακράν. Την φίλην ενθυμείται καμπανίαν του, των κήπων του, την έπαυλην, των πρωινών περίπατων, των βίων του προ 6 μηνών. Και καταράται εις την αγωνία του τη σύγκλιτον τη μοχθηράν.
The viewpoint of the poet is not evident at all in this poem. The judgmental words, hateful, misiton, vile, athlia, dear, philin, and malice, the adjective malicious, mokthiran in Greek, These clearly represent the thoughts of Tacitus and not Cavafy. The poem's not a dramatic monologue since it's in the third person, but one of Cavafy's variations on the dramatic monologue, the oblique presentation of a character's thoughts and feelings. Some of the slides are just to keep us in Alexandria, in Cavafy's location. Most of modern Greek poetry, both before and after Cavafy, with the notable exception of Seferis among poets of the first rank, most of this poetry is delivered to us in the voice of the poet, who makes declarations about the world or the fate of his nation, who tells us of his emotions and reactions, his struggles, his frustrations, and his triumphs. This is the romantic notion of the artist as hero. It is the essence of lyric poetry, of the modern, if not the ancient kind. But it's the dramatic monologue and its variants that can liberate the poet from lyrical romanticism. Though invented perhaps by Tennyson, in English poetry it was Robert Browning who made the form his own. And it is to Browning, who died in 1869, when Cavafy was only 6, that one must turn to find the key to what made Cavafy Cavafy, and made him different from all Greek poets who preceded him and most who followed him. But it's not only the form of the dramatic monologue that Cavafy took from Browning. Browning was, I believe, the first English poet since Shakespeare who succeeded in putting something very close to ordinary speech into verse. In a time when most poets were still using the 17th century diction of Shakespeare and Milton, now fossilized as a special poetic language. And Cavafy often did the same as Browning, using something close to ordinary Greek speech. And this is one of the reasons why many critics in his day claimed that what he wrote was not poetry, because it largely avoided conventional poetic language. Let us pause for a moment and consider the history of the publication of Cavafy's poems in his lifetime. By 1903, when he reached the age of 40, he had about 40 poems published in various literary journals, newspapers, and almanacs, mainly in Alexandria, Cairo, or Athens. These included a few translations from English. The early poetry was, for the most part, competent but conventional and undistinguished, offering little intimation of what was to come. It was often influenced by French decadent poets and expressed a kind of romantic pessimism. But in 1903 he embarked on what he grandly called, in English, a philosophical scrutiny of his poems. This led him to reject many and revise others, and to produce by early 1905 a collection of 14 poems privately printed and distributed, with the simple title Poemata, Poems, and the date 1904. With this private publication, if that's not a contradiction in terms, Cavafy had found the method of dissemination of his poems, which was to last his lifetime. He never sought commercial publication of a volume of his poetry. Many collections followed, some arranged thematically, but the more recent poems always circulated in folders pinned together and arranged by date of first publication. And the date of that first collection, 1904, marks the point at which Cavafy had found his direction as a poet. No poem published after this date was ever rejected. He had found his style, his method, his tone of voice. In Poems 1904, the poems were arranged thematically, as in the later enlarged version known as Poems 1910. And the first poem in those collections is significantly entitled Phones, Voices. Significantly because Cavafy is a poetry of voices. Unfortunately, in all of George Sirigi's standard editions of Cavafy, the poems published before 1905 are relegated to appendices, following the two other thematic collections, Poems 1905 to 15 and Poems 1916 to 18. But in the Oxford World Classics dual language edition of the Cavafy canon, for which I had the opportunity to edit the Greek text, restoring it to the state in which Cavafy himself left it in the latest printing of each poem, I was also able to determine the sequence of the collection's in the poem. So poems 1910 appears first, and Voices is therefore the first poem in the volume. The translations in the book are not mine, but those of my friend Evangelos Peroglou, who's already been mentioned. Disembodied and beloved voices of those who have died or of those who are for us lost like the dead. Sometimes within our dreams they speak. Sometimes immersed in thought the mind may hear them. And with the sound of them for a moment there return sounds from the first poetry of our life, like music in the night, far off, that fades away.
Φωνές. Ιδανικές φωνές και αγαπημένες. Εκείνων που πεθάναν ή εκείνων που είναι για μας χαμένοι σαν τους πεθαμένους. Κάποτε μες στα όνειρά μας ομιλούνε. Κάποτε μες στην σκέψη της ακούει το μυαλό. Και με τον ήχον των για μια στιγμή επιστρέφουν. Ήχοι από την πρώτη ποίηση της ζωής μας. Σαν μουσική, τη νύχτα μακρινή που σβήνει.
Αγαπητοί φίλοι, πήραμε μια γεύση της εκδήλωσης προσεγγίζοντας τον Καβάφη μέσα και έξω από τη σχολική τάξη. Την όλη εκδήλωση και την ευθύνη της παρουσίασης και του καλέσματος είχε συντονίστρια εκπαίδευσης κυρία Βαρβάρα Καμπουρίδη. Η εκδήλωση έγινε την 8η Νοεμβρίου του 2013 στο Europe House στο Λονδίνο. Εμείς θα είμαστε και πάλι κοντά σας την ερχομένη Τρίτη με ένα διαφορετικό θέμα. Γεια σας.